Welcome, everybody. This panel is Initial Margin State of Play. I'm John Pucciarelli, Director of Strategic Initiatives here at Acadiasoft. I've been here now for a few weeks, maybe. But I'm not new to any of these panels. We've done these before together. So why don't I just introduce the panelists, and I guess I'll go from my left all the way down. Alan Lewis, Managing Director, Collateral Management and Segregation at BNY Mellon. Next to him is Andrew Barron. He is a Senior Project Manager and Business Analyst at Nomura. Next to Alan is my former colleague, Tara Cruz, Global Head of Infrastructure Data and the Non-Cleared Margin at ISDA. And then next to Tara is, you all know, Mark Demo, Head of Strategy for Acadiasoft. So anyway, how we're going to do this, there's three topics that we're going to hit for this particular panel. We're obviously, you heard Chris talk about the BCBS and IOSCO statement yesterday, so we're going to get into that. We also are going to talk about, I know there's a panel on documentation that Mark just mentioned, but we're going to get into a little bit into that topic as well. And then finally, we'll kind of dive into discussions on the differences between how phases 1 to 3 prepared for the margin rules and what we're seeing and what the differences are from everyone's perspective on getting ready for phase 4 and 5. So with that, let's jump in to the advocacy piece. I'm going to turn to Tara first. Tara, obviously you're probably ridiculously busy. Knowing that statement came out yesterday, it's very timely that we're having this discussion today, so I'm thankful to the folks at BCBS and IOSCO for doing that yesterday. But can you just give us your perspective on what that statement means for the industry? And if you want to dive into a little bit about the advocacy itself, but maybe we could talk about the statement itself.
Yeah, sure, happy to, John. So if you haven't seen the statement or you haven't, been looking at it for the last 2 days like I have with people, I think the key piece that we care about here is it says the Basel Committee and IOSCO note that the framework does not specify documentation, custodial or operational requirements if the bilateral initial margin amount does not exceed the framework's 50 million euro initial margin threshold. It's expected, however, that covered entities will act diligently when their exposures approach the threshold to ensure that the relevant arrangements needed are in place if the threshold is exceeded. This is an advocacy win, right? This is one of the things that we asked regulators for because we saw an inconsistency in the regulations in terms of whether there was an explicit requirement to have regulatory compliant IM documentation and custodial arrangements in place. So we asked regulators to clarify if in fact their rules allowed for that, or where regulations might require the documentation to instead be globally consistent and provide some leniency around that point, knowing that there would be a lot of market participants who would be unlikely to post any IM in the beginning stages of their Reg IM requirements. So the statement is intended to help satisfy that ask, right? Yeah, it's kind of vague, right? So we've been getting a lot of questions. What does it mean? What do I do now, right? It's not a change in the rules per se, right? It doesn't bring parties out of scope, right? It just provides, I think, a little leeway. It's a release valve, if you will, for the bottleneck that we perceive that we have ahead of us for September 1st, 2020, such that relationships that expect that they will not breach the $50 million IM threshold would not have to have their reg compliant IM CSAs, all their custodial arrangements, other operational setups in place by that point in order to continue to trade, right? So that's good. But it doesn't mean you can take a back seat and do nothing, right? Because you're still in scope, right? You still need to do your ANA calculations, right? You still need to figure out whether you're in scope, and if you pass that $8 billion threshold, you're caught by the regulation, and you're still going to have operational effort, you're still going to have compliance risk that you have to deal with, because you're going to have to monitor whether you are approaching that $50 million IM threshold. So you need a mechanism to do that. You're going to have to implement or engage a vendor like Acadiasoft to calculate your IM for you, whether that's via via grid or via SIM, you need to be able to do that. Or depending on the jurisdiction you're in, you might be able to have your dealer do that, but there should be an affirmative requirement for you to monitor where you're at and then move forward in a timely fashion when you need to make sure that you can get in place the relevant documentation and operational processes to be able to exchange IM when you need it. Okay. So I think it's a good thing. According to our data, there's probably 70 to 80% of the relationships that are subject to phase 5 that could take advantage of this, that won't be exchanging regulatory IM in the near term. So it's good, right? But it's not a panacea to the challenges that market participants are going to face. So we would still encourage you to move forward, try to get prepared. The extent to which you can get some of the steps done, please do so, right? If you're a counterparty who is unlikely to exchange IM, then okay, you can breathe a little bit and back off and not worry so much that if you're in a long queue with your counterparties or your custodians that you're not going to make it and you're going to have a regulatory enforcement action sitting on top of you. So I think that's good. Certainly off the back of this, we'll probably be expecting some additional clarity or statements from some regulators who might echo what this means for them. And I think that will be hopefully come out and be useful to market participants to help them understand how you need to prepare for this next phase. If you're going to choose to not go ahead and get everything in place, now you have to have a monitoring mechanism instead, right? Chris referred to that. Now you have this other obligation, so you have to decide how you're going to go about doing that if you're directly subject to the regulations. If you're a client in the US, you might be able to rely on your dealer to do that because they're the ones who'd be on the hook. But in other jurisdictions, you might be the one who would be responsible for confirming to your regulator that you're monitoring this appropriately. I'll also add, this is helpful. I'm glad the regulators have done this, but we're not done advocating, right? We're not backing off yet, right? And I think the door is still open, right? We've come a long way, right?
I've been working.
I mean, we've been pushing on this for a long time, right? And I think what we see here is we say, okay, well, great, this is helpful, right? But we still have this situation that I think was not intended where you have hundreds of counterparties who are caught by a regulation, but not actually posting in the IM. What's the value to that, right? Does that make sense? Does that meet the original policy objectives? We think not, right? And therefore, things like taking physically settled FX swaps and forwards out of the ANA calculation or raising the threshold could take counterparties totally out of scope and not leave them in this limbo land where they're having compliance risk and operational effort that does not actually contribute to meet policy objectives. So we think the dialogue is still open with regulators. If you notice the last sentence in their statement, they say they will continue to monitor the effect of meeting the final stages of phase-in scheduled for 2020, right? That's the foot in the door, right, that allows us to still have a dialogue with the regulators. And we know there are some regulators, who are sympathetic and do believe that there is reason and there's cause and there's data that backs recalibrating some of these requirements. So we're going to continue to have that dialogue with the regulators and see if we can get more than what they've given us here.
Tara, we're not going to hold you to this, but in terms of the individual jurisdictional regulators, timetable on this? I mean, are we looking at months, weeks, days?
On when they might individually say something?
I mean, any clue?
We don't really know yet. I think it's early days, right?
But it can't be a year from now, right? It's going to have to be within the next few months.
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Andrew, I know that's a lot. Thank you very much for that. Andrew, from a dealer's perspective, knowing all this now, I know yesterday it's kind of new news, but I think people were kind of expecting some of this, right? It's not, like you said, a wholesale change, but it's certainly kind of putting a stamp on, hey, you might not have to document if you're not going to breach the 50 million. From your perspective, from a dealer perspective, what does this mean for your firm, and what does it mean for dealers?
Well, obviously I'm looking at it from a project management perspective, and I think, it all goes into how we structure the approach of our project. First and foremost, as dealers, we want to remain regulatory compliant and avoid any trading interruptions to our clients. We make measured assumptions based on where we think the advocacy may land. Obviously, this is one point of our advocacy that is potentially beneficial to the industry. But we are ready to react to more stringent or lenient approaches as the advocacy resolve themselves, one way or the other.
Okay. Great. And Alan, from the custodial perspective, what does this statement mean for you or for your firm?
I think, first of all, from the custodial perspective, I'm glad that the custodian got a proper chair at this 2020. I think in Toronto, Mark dragged over a broken out folding chair and all the other panels.
Now you got a seat, so.
So it feels comfortable.
Good.
I think regulation is a tricky thing. Sometimes it's against you, sometimes it's for you. Obviously, as a service provider in the collateral space, these the regulatory tailwinds for UMR commercially is good for us. We're a business. We offer a service. We're trying to help the industry. I think so. When it comes to advocacy, and if you kind of transparently talk to us behind closed walls, and where do we stand? Well. Business is good, and the more business you can get, the better. But I think the counter to that, to some of the other commentary, is that some of the advocacy, I think, is important because it has to be reasonable, the regulation. And I think that everybody is concerned about capacity gluts. Everybody's concerned that do the rules become so onerous that it knocks out participants, that it limits the derivative players, particularly in the uncleared space? Does it limit liquidity? Does it have other unforeseen consequences? And also, from a commercial perspective, you don't, with all these other capacity issues, do you really want to be focusing on a whole bunch of small little clients that maybe really shouldn't be in it to begin with? Because this is a massive exercise, and I think everybody's should be aware of that. But even if you're a small firm, even if you're a large firm, even if you're an asset manager with one or many funds, both the operational and the papering perspective is tremendous. So, I'll keep it short on that. Again, we are in the business of providing services to clients who have segregation needs. So it is a panacea, so to speak, for us right now, this regulation. But I would say that we are in support of those advocacies that make it just more sensible and more controllable.
Mark, any comments on this from your perspective, from an Acadiasoft perspective?
Well, I mean, my only question is, as I sit here, is like, so how does this guidance, where does the rubber meet the road on this guidance, right? In terms of, let's say, if I'm a hedge fund and I trade with 24 different dealers, right? And I can look through my portfolio, and I have, okay, let's say 5 of my relationships I know that are going to breach the 50 million threshold right away, right? I'm prepared on that. But the other ones might not, because I trade less with them. So does that mean that? Well, of course, naturally, I would have been prioritizing the 5 that are my largest trading relationships. But does that mean that the other 19 where I don't breach the threshold, does that mean that I don't have to paper those yet? And I just need to monitor as I get close? Is that the right way to think about this?
Yes, right. That's the result here. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think that is a win, and I think it helps you walk towards the regulatory deadline as opposed to run to it. And everyone running through the same door at the same time is a bad idea. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it sounds like they heard the industry calls in terms of that bottleneck, and they're doing something about that, at least in this perspective. All right, I'll switch gears, and we'll kind of dive into a little bit on documentation. Everybody remembers the VM Big Bang? Went really well, smoothly? No? Yeah, negotiation was quite difficult, and everybody who kind of experienced that, either from a dealer side, knows that there was quite a few challenges and a lot of hiccups. There are a couple of online doc negotiating systems that are going head-to-head in the market. Acadiasoft obviously is working with both of them. But I would like to get perspectives from our panelists, and everyone's going to come at it from a different perspective, on kind of the use of these tools and what that's going to mean for your business, what it's going to mean for your clients. So Andrew, I'll go to you. In terms of, I know, and we're going to deep dive into this later, But in terms of the CSA negotiation space, from your perspective, you can give us that idea. What are some of the things you're looking for in a solution? Does it have to cover every document, just the CSA? I mean, I'm sure you're going to want everything soup to nuts, you're going to say that, but for these phases, for phases 4 and 5, what are you looking for in a tool like that?
Yeah, I think I will cover to your point a little bit of what we want from the tool, outside of initial margin. And as has been alluded to, phases 4 and 5, the client list is greater than we have seen for the first 3 phases, obviously, and we're looking for a solution that makes anything negotiation-wise, documentation, execution, to be more streamlined, right? A couple of the things, I'll dive into a couple points that we have voiced to these competitors in the market. Number one is the ability to handle all legal documentation, right? So obviously, John, you mentioned specific focus on initial margin, which is what we're here for, which is what they should cater for, obviously, at the onset. But, the usefulness of these tools after phase 5 is something that we're looking for, right? The ability to execute GMRAs or repo agreements, right? Outside of just standard CSAs and ACAs is something that I think, some tools like that are being created in the initial margin space now may have utility, well into the future, right? So obviously, with these initial margin agreements becoming cumbersome, and there are plenty of them to execute, we are looking for a streamlined solution that helps us any way we can get it. Something else we're looking for is integration with our IT infrastructure, right? So from the moment we open a negotiation on the platform to the execution, we expect that these platforms will be able to SDP these agreements into our legal applications such that we don't have to sit there, and have our legal teams keying in 10,000 agreements overnight.
That's why we integrate to both of them.
Fair point, yeah. Another feature that we would like are controls. We do anticipate these platforms being used by various levels throughout our organization. And it's important to make sure that the right people have access to do their required job, right? We don't need, our analyst executing CSAs and ACAs on behalf of Nomura. Obviously, that is reserved for the more senior folks at our firm. One other thing, or a couple other things, Japanese language capability. Obviously, we're Nomura. We conduct negotiations in English, Japanese, plenty other languages, I'm sure, but something that will be useful, and we do understand that a majority of the negotiations take place in English. Support for Japanese, French, et cetera, and so forth. That would be very useful. And to close off, probably the most important thing, and I know that there are marketing folks in here, that it does what it's supposed to do, right? We all have been sold a box of goods, right? We want to make sure that where we're utilizing these tools and they're very helpful, that if it solves one problem, we're not looking for it to create another. So ease of transition and negotiation and utility and making sure that these platforms actually do what they are intended to do.
Tara, I mean, I don't know if your Create people are here, but Japanese, you get that down, French?
I'll take that no.
Yeah.
I don't know about that one, but
Okay.
but I
don't know if
will
the
say
margin exchange people are here.
that one of the reasons that is to started to do is to create was the experience we had with VM, right? We tracked the charts, right? We knew the feedback that went to the regulators was showing this trend where, I have this many VM CSAs executed, but I only have this many up to date in my system. There was this lag because there was no data that sat behind those CSAs that would allow you to feed it into your system, that would allow you to give it to your vendor, right? So that was sort of one of the, key reasons where we saw there was a need in the market to find a way for people to execute agreements on a larger scale, knowing, IM phase 5 was coming, but also, what's the data on the back end that makes that transition much easier and takes out, errors that might come from keying. And I can only speak to Is2Create, but certainly the intention was always that it's a system that can handle many different agreements, and the intention is to try to make it as broad and useful as possible for market participants, starting with the CSA for IM, since that's where the most compelling need is.
Alan, similar to what Andrew said from your perspective, is anything different in terms of the promise of these online negotiation tools for custodial agreements, ACAs, et cetera? What are you looking for? And obviously, these systems were created for the future, But really for the immediate need now, that bottleneck that hopefully we'll get an ease from. But from a custodian point of view, what are you looking for in a tool?
First of all, I really want to echo, I think, some of the things that Andrew said. I think that the future application of these tools could be tremendous. All of you who deal with the legal, the contractual process, with the emails, with the red lines, it really has, I think, a lot of future benefits. There's some challenges around how many of them should be out there and how many, how split it is, because if you start to have to use multiple systems for a singular exercise, that could almost be as convoluted as just dealing with the old back and forth paper way. But again, I think when we started to engage both with ISDA Create and Margin Exchange, you're early on, and I think what we really wanted to, and what we're working with these providers on, is we really want a self-contained system. I think one of the interesting things was you had a bunch of law firms partnering with a bunch of technology companies, and they put out a product where you couldn't redline, which is probably one of the most important tools that counsel has. And so really the value add of these platforms diminished significantly when you had to export documents, take them out of system. So what we've been working on, really from not the IMCSA perspective, but really trying to get a more generic documentation flow, is what is the control as you upload your documents into a system, as you shoot them, as you agree templates with your clients, if they have to go onto tri-party, quad-party, multiple party kind of negotiations, how does that distribution work? How does the back and forth red line and the tickling, the ticklers that go out to let people know how does that work? And then kind of all the way down to when you come to contract execution, being able to do it both, wet and electronic. Getting that self-contained process flow, I think, is very important. I think in some other forums, we're really working hard to try to have something for 2020. I think that it's aggressive if we can get something by 2019 for phase 4, but I think at where we are right now, if we can, I think it'll be a tremendous benefit for the industry to start to utilize that if a good workflow is there to help manage, again, the paper. But I think that, again, Andrew hit it spot on, was that we're really also looking past 2020. We're looking to see how we can use this for all types of documentation that we have to process. With the caveat that I mentioned earlier, that we also want to make, it has to have the right integration, it has to be a smooth process, and to do a singular exercise, it's really a utility or one or two strong utilities that come out will make it manageable. But if you have to deal for a singular exercise with half a dozen, 10, if it's going all, that might make it a little bit unwieldy. But right now, I think that there's a small handful of players in the space, and we're engaged with them.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these offerings, and I think there's probably a lot more. There will be more to come, and even new technologies that might integrate with them are going to make it even more valuable. Mark, from an Acadiasoft perspective, can you just give us kind of where we are in terms of doc negotiation? Give us a little flavor of that.
I think the Agreement Manager product that we're developing is integrated into ISDA Create and Margin Exchange already for our phase 1 level of data that we've identified. So the fact that we can communicate back and forth with these platforms exists. We are integrated into document digitization providers, such that if you want to go back, so that you don't just limit the clients who want to digitize documents for new ones that they put in place going forward. If you want to create a single golden source repository of all of your agreements, and you want to work on your historical documents or your existing documents, we've partnered with digitization providers that are integrated directly into Agreement Manager, so that you can store your data and then compare it versus your counterparty's data in the same location. And then the and we're in UAT testing right now. So you'll hear much more from Richard, but I think it's a great story. And Alan, the fact that actually we think it's a good idea that there are more participants in this space, and the reason why AcadiaSoft exists is to be able to create is to help facilitate growth of these options, but yet standardizing how we store and communicate the data, right? In the same way that we built a system for the standardization of communication of margin calls and wrap workflow around it so that we all use it today, it's the exact same thing that we want to do in the document space. And so we think that helps facilitate competition and accelerate the development of really what's an exciting marketplace. So.
Great. Thanks. All right, let's switch gears now. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between getting ready for phase 1 and 3 and how phase 4 and 5 are going to differ. As many of you know, AcadiaSoft has worked with every phase 1, 2, and 3 firm. Hopefully we're going to continue that trend with phase 4. But there are going to be differences in terms of how the approach is going to be, and then we're going to kind of dive into that and get everyone's perspective. So I'll start with Mark. Can you describe the 3 different ways that phase 1, 2, and 3 firms typically interact with AcadiaSoft, and then tell us a little bit about how AcadiaSoft is going to change to support phase 4 and 5?
Sure. Really quickly. You have 3 different use cases that were standard in phase 1, 2, and 3, and that was either the dealer calculates the CRIF, does their own SIM calculation, they create their own CRIF, and they send it to AcadiaSoft, and we calculate initial margin, and then we compare the inputs to the initial margin calculation in the reconciliation tool, IM Exposure Manager, right, when the counterparty provides the same thing. On the other end, so basically you have local calculation of initial margin using MarginSphere for communication of the messaging and using the IMEM platform for reconciliation. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have a number of dealers who actually use AcadiaSoft as the primary source of the IM exposure calculation. So they'll do the CRIF, they'll send the CRIF to us, we'll do the IM exposure calculation, we'll send the data, they'll also send us their margin balances and their agreement terms, and we'll calculate the margin call and we'll issue and respond for them over MarginSphere. So you have sort of traditional local use of local calculation and then use of the messaging software, and then on the other end of the spectrum you have early adopters of central hub, central workflow technology, right? And then in the middle you have other firms who use us for primary SIM calc, but then they take that data back into their collateral systems, calculate the margin call, and send it back to us through AcadiaSoft. And the way that those use cases have changed now is that with the advent of buy side coming into the equation, and the buy side particularly being brought in the U.S. where the dealer has the requirement to collect and post. So the buy side has the idea is how AcadiaSoft has pursued this idea of how can we help the buy side help meet the compliance challenge, but in the most inexpensive way possible. And that is either the there's no new business that comes out of this, right? It's pure cost. So how can we do it as cheaply and quickly as possible? And so so it's facilitating the options around sensitivity calculation. So you send us your trades, we'll calculate sensitivities, we'll calculate CRIF, we'll calculate IM exposure, send it back to you if you want to calculate the call, or we'll calculate the call. A little bit later in the program, we'll have we'll do an infomercial on our one connection, one solution service, and I think you'll find it pretty compelling But that's essentially we're expanding the calculation capabilities of the platform to be able to support firms who wanted to use SIM but can't do the calculations themselves, or actually want the dealer to do the calculation, and because we face off against every phase 1, 2, and 3 firm that's in scope, and hopefully every phase 4 firm, you'll have the ability to meet the dealer, meet your dealer population in the AcadiaSoft hub one way or another, calculating or having someone else calculate.
Thank you, Mark. So AcadiaSoft is going to solve all of the phase 4 and 5 problems, and we're going to do it very cheaply or inexpensively.
Yeah.
Value add.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah. Hey, just trying to sum it up for you. Thank you. Alan, phase 4 from your perspective, how's it going? Same as phase 1 to 3? Differences? More challenging or about the same?
I would say there are differences.
Okay.
I think what clients are faced with now, and we're really having this dialogue with the asset management community, it's really a perfect storm of things that everybody has to focus on. You have to worry about SIM, we're talking about that. You have to repaper your IMCSAs. You have to do these calcs to see if you need to segregate or not, and what does that mean? You have to put this architecture in. You have to do it in a very, very quick period of time. And not only do you need to put it in place for yourself, but when you're receiving collateral, you have to work with your counterparties to figure out where they're posted. And what does that mean to you, and what contracts are involved with that, and what plumbing is needed for that. I think we're starting to see a paradigm shift with the mentality of, let's just say, the buy-side community when it comes to the two predominant segregation architectures in the marketplace. There's a concept, third party, we can talk offline a little bit more in depth about these models, but third party really is your traditional custody account with an account control agreement, a segregation wrapper, but you and your counterparty pretty much are responsible for everything that happens in that account. Delivering in, their control usually is the release back. But when it comes to how much, the eligibility, all the other great stuff that goes with really, is the contents of that account correct, falls on the two counterparties. It's a one-to-one model. So for every CSA you have that you have to collateralize, you'll have a physical custody footprint, for that account. As opposed to tri-party, which is more of a one-to-many, a much more robust architecture. At the entity level, you fund unencumbered collateral into a custodial long box, and off of that, we create tri-party accounts or any type of agreement, beyond UMR, that you might need, and they're governed by their own rule sets that manage eligibility, concentration limits, sufficiency, handles substitution. It's a very robust industrial strength model. What we've been doing a lot of education. As a service provider, we provide both constructs, but we've been doing a lot of education on what tri-party means. I think that there's been a historic misconception from the asset management community that tri-party is dealer-related, it's dealer-centric. Yes, they use it to fund themselves, but it's kind of this, dark kind of system over here that is sell-side oriented. It's not for the buy-side. What we're seeing, and this is the paradigm shift, is that tri-party architectures are a very good architecture to handle your UMR requirements depending on the size and scale and complexity of your operation. And so we're seeing buy-side shops now really take a hard look at this. And part of the discussion is also that there are only a few tri-party agents out there, but every asset manager is going to most likely be receiving in bulk at one of these tri-party agents. So even if you choose a construct where you're posting third party, you're still going to be receiving tri-party. So you have to get familiar with it. And I think as they start to see what this architecture is, if it makes sense for them, hey, this makes sense for me to go both ways. It kind of limits my operational complexity. Again, depending on my size, my complexity, the asset mix that I want to use, some of the other sophistications of what I need to do, it really handles it. So I think that, to your question, we're starting to have these conversations en masse. We're starting to continue to work with phase 4 clients to get them ready for this September. And I think that at least the industry outreach that's been going on for the past 3 years in terms of advocacy has really started to kick in, because the phones are ringing off the hook. I mean, so I think the message is out there, and so every year we've seen next year participants come to the table earlier to give themselves more runway to get ready.
Ellen, are you seeing a lot of Phase 4 clients using Tri-Party mostly, or is it a mix?
So to date, what we're seeing is, so the first 3 phases are
All Tri-Party.
all Tri-Party. With those secondary, tertiary global dealers that are going live, still Tri-Party.
That makes
With there's going to be a handful of hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds that are getting wrapped up this year, and it's a mixed bag. But I think that depending on, if you had this conversation a year or 2 ago, people would have said, they're going to stick with what they know. They're going to go in a third-party construct. They're not going to even look at Tri-Party. And I think that more and more are taking a harder look at Tri-Party. So it's not going to be so one-sided, I think, going into 20.
Okay. Let's move along. Tara, from an ISDA perspective, the differences between phases 1 and 3. I was there for phase 1 and 3. Things like the multilateral self-disclosure exercises. What are those challenges that you're kind of ramping up for from an ISDA perspective for phases 4 and 5? Maybe more 5, but what are you seeing from that angle?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, making sure that these market participants, are aware of the requirements. I think there's been a lot of industry education information coming out. It's always good to hear that market participants are coming forward, right? And I think they are sort of waking up and coming forward and trying to assess whether they're in scope. So making sure that market participants understand, that they might be subject to these regulations and that they need to prepare to be able to do their ANA calculations, and that they need to do an indicative ANA calculation so that they can disclose to their counterparties early on so they can begin the process, right? We think that it takes 12 to 18 months to get ready, right, end to end. And therefore, you really have to engage with your counterparties and your custodians early on and tell them, I think I might be in scope. So you're sort of forced to do that. We do have, ISDA has a bilateral self-disclosure letter that's out there. In our bookstore, that's supported on the ISDA Amend platform if you want to disclose multilaterally, right? It's not a formal representation I'm definitely in, because we know you haven't hit the formal ANA calculation period, but it's an early indicator option. So you can multilaterally deliver it. We also have, through the years, conducted a sort of multilateral disclosure exercise, and we're probably going to do another refresh of that. So just trying to provide different mechanisms to help market participants get that notification out there so they can begin to exchange the important pieces of information that they need to get prepared, like, which custodians am I going to use? So you can, start those discussions and start to agree the key elements that are important for your CSAs. How are you going to calculate the initial margin? Things like this.
Great. Thank you. Andrew, you've been doing this for quite a while. You've been through phases 1 to 3. What are the things that you're seeing now, the new challenges from a Nomura perspective? Are firms able to calculate SIM for themselves, things like that? Can you kind of expand on that?
And I think there are a couple things that obviously Alan and Tara have both touched on. I think, a couple things that we're looking at are, obviously, with the introduction of some of these firms, phase 4, phase 5 firms, we do expect a healthy amount of new custodians to be introduced, right? So, like Alan had mentioned, phases 1 through 3, Tri-Party predominantly. With these new third-party custodians, and it's to note, we have no control over what our counterparty chooses. If our counterparty would like to post to a third-party custodian, that is their choice and their choice only. So as dealers, we need to be prepared to build new SWIFT messages to custodians, right? New end-of-day balance files, new ACA documents, right? New legal negotiations. And it's an important thing, obviously, we would like if there were a handful of third-party custodians, or if phase 4 and phase 5 firms coalesced with tri-party agents, but we do realize that the reality of that happening is not great. And we are preparing internally. Obviously, we are looking at some industry solutions that are out there to deal with the glut of custodians that we expect to come into scope, and we're planning on ramping up our IT infrastructure absolutely more towards 2020 as we get into the smaller, even smaller firms in phase 5. A couple other things, the IM calculation approach, right? So the SIM it's complicated to implement. We do realize we are users of the SIM. We do realize that we will be taking requests from our counterparties to be the sole calculation agent, or interfacing with a third-party vendor, or, if worse comes to worse, standardized calculation, which may no longer make the trades economically viable. So we're definitely, taking that into account and preparing our IT infrastructures to be able to support, calculating on counterparties' behalf, but also taking into account what that really means from a regulatory perspective, right? Back testing, benchmarking, some of these things that are really taking a lot of time from our global markets and our risk management departments. What does it mean to us to actually say, okay, we will calculate on your behalf? And lastly, one thing that hasn't been touched on is independent amount. So some of these phase 4, phase 5 firms historically have had to post independent amount per trade. I do know that Acadia Soft is heavily looking into the independent amount space, and what will we do, right? Regulatory IM comes in, does it replace IA? Do we run both calculations simultaneously? What do we do if IA is greater than IM, right? Where do we segregate the entire amount? Do we just default to Reg IM? Do we split the amounts, right? Post the Reg IM to a custodian and take in the IA. These are things, obviously, that as we move further along towards phase 5, we'll have to solve for.
Great. All right. I think we are out of time. I just want to thank our panelists.